Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Oliver Twist, and we're starting with chapter 23, which contains the substance of a pleasant conversation between Mr. Bumble and a lady, and shows that even a beadle may be susceptible on some points. The night was bitter cold. The snow lay on the ground, frozen into a hard, thick crust, so that only the heaps that had drifted into byways and corners were affected by the sharp wind that howled abroad, which, as if expending increased fury on such prey as it found, caught it savagely up in clouds, and whirling it into 1,000 misty eddies, scattered it in air. Bleak, dark, and piercing cold, it was a night for the well-housed and fed to draw round the bright fire, and thank God they were at home, and for the homeless, starving wretch to lay him down and die. Many hunger-worn outcasts close their eyes in our bare streets at such times, who, let their crimes have been what they may, can hardly open them in a more bitter world. Excuse me. Such was the aspect of out-of-doors affairs when Mrs. Corney, the matron of the workhouse to which our readers have been already introduced as the birthplace of Oliver Twist, sat herself down before a cheerful fire in her own little room, and glanced with no small degree of complacency at a small round table on which stood a tray of corresponding size, furnished with all necessary materials for the most grateful meal that matrons enjoy. In fact, Mrs. Corney was about to solace herself with a cup of tea, as she glanced from the table to the fireplace, where the smallest of all possible kettles was singing a small song in a small voice. Her inward satisfaction evidently increased, so much so indeed that Mrs. Corney smiled. "Well," said the matron, leaning her elbow on the table and looking reflectively at the fire, "I'm sure we have all on us a great deal to be grateful for. A great deal, if we did but know it. Ah!" Mrs. Corney shook her head mournfully, as if deploring the mental blindness of those paupers who did not know it, and thrusting a silver spoon, private property, into the inmost recesses of a 2-ounce tin tea-caddy, proceeded to make the tea. How slight a thing will disturb the equanimity of our frail minds. The black teapot, being very small and easily filled, ran over while Mrs. Corney was moralizing, and the water slightly scalded Mrs. Corney's hand. "Drat the pot," said the worthy matron, setting it down very hastily on the hob. "A little stupid thing that only holds a couple of cups. What use is it of to anybody? Except," said Mrs. Corney, pausing, "except to a poor desolate creature like me. Oh dear." With these words, the matron dropped into her chair, and once more resting her elbow on the table, thought of her solitary fate. The small teapot and the single cup had awakened in her mind sad recollections of Mr. Corney, who had not been dead more than 25 years, and she was overpowered. "I shall never get another," said Mrs. Corney pettishly. "I shall never get another like him." Whether this remark bore reference to the husband or the teapot is uncertain. It might have been the latter, for Mrs. Corney looked at it as she spoke and took it up afterwards. She had just tasted her first cup when she was disturbed by a soft tap at the room door. "Oh, come in with you," said Mrs. Corney sharply. "Some of the old women dying, I suppose. They always die when I'm at meals. Don't stand there letting the cold air in, don't. What's amiss now, eh?" "Nothing, ma'am, nothing," replied a man's voice. "Dear me," exclaimed the matron in a much sweeter tone, "is that Mr. Bumble?" "At your service, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, who had been stopping outside to rub his shoes clean and to shake the snow off his coat, and who now made his appearance bearing the cocked hat in one hand and a bundle in the other. "Shall I shut the door, ma'am?" The lady modestly hesitated to reply, lest there should be any impropriety in holding an interview with Mr. Bumble with closed doors. Mr. Bumble, taking advantage of the hesitation, and being very cold himself, shut it without further permission. "Hard weather, Mr. Bumble," said the matron. "Hard indeed, ma'am," replied the beadle. "Anti-parochial weather this, ma'am. We have given away, Mrs. Corney, we have given away a matter of 20 quartern loaves and a cheese and a half this very blessed afternoon, and yet them paupers are not contented." "Of course not. When would they be, Mr. Bumble?" said the matron, sipping her tea. "When indeed, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "Why, here's one man that, in consideration of his wife and large family, has a quartern loaf and a good pound of cheese full weight. Is he grateful, ma'am? Is he grateful? Not a copper farthing's worth of it. What does he do, ma'am, but ask for a few coals? If it's only a pocket handkerchief full, he says. Coals! What would he do with coals? Toast his cheese with them and then come back for more. That's the way with these people, ma'am. Give 'em an apronful of coals today, and they'll come back for another the day after tomorrow, as brazen as alabaster." The matron expressed her entire concurrence in this intelligible simile, and the beadle went on. I never, said Mr. Bumble, see anything like the pitches it's got to. The day afore yesterday, a man, you have been a married woman, ma'am, and I may mention it to you, a man with hardly a rag upon his back, here Mrs. Corney looked at the floor, goes to our overseer's door when he has got company coming to dinner and says he must be relieved, Mrs. Corney. As he wouldn't go away and shock the company very much, our overseer sent him out a pound of potatoes and half a pint of oatmeal. My heart, says the ungrateful villain, what's the use of this to me? You might as well give me a pair of iron spectacles. Very good, says our overseer, taking him away again. You won't get anything else here. Then I'll die in the streets, says the vagrant. Oh, no, you won't, says our overseer. Ha ha, that was very good. So like Mr. Granite, wasn't it? Interposed the matron. Well, Mr. Bumble? Well, ma'am, rejoined the beadle. He went away, and he did die in the streets. There's an obstinate pauper for you. It beats anything I could have believed, observed the matron emphatically. But don't you think out-of-door relief a very bad thing anyway, Mr. Bumble? You're a gentleman of experience and ought to know. Come. Mrs. Corney, said the beadle, smiling as men smile who are conscious of superior information. Out-of-door relief, properly managed, ma'am, is the parochial safeguard. The great principle of out-of-door relief is to give the paupers exactly what they don't want, and then they get tired of coming. Dear me, exclaimed Mrs. Corney, well, that is a good one, too. Yes, betwixt you and me, ma'am, returned Mr. Bumble. That's the great principle, and that's the reason why, if you look at any cases that get into them audacious newspapers, you'll always observe that sick families have been relieved with slices of cheese. That's the rule now, Mrs. Corney, all over the country. But however, said the beadle, stooping to unpack his bundle, these are official secrets, ma'am, not to be spoken of except as I may say, among the parochial officers such as ourselves. This is the port wine, ma'am, that the board ordered for the infirmary. Real, fresh, genuine port wine, only out of the cask this forenoon, clear as a bell, and no sediment. Excuse me. Having held the first bottle up to the light and shaken it well to test its excellence, Mr. Bumble placed them both on the top of a chest of drawers, folded the handkerchief in which they had been wrapped, put it carefully in his pocket, and took up his hat as if to go. You'll have a very cold walk, Mr. Bumble, said the matron. It blows, ma'am, replied Mr. Bumble, turning up his coat collar, enough to cut one's ears off. The matron looked from the little kettle to the beadle, who was moving towards the door, and as the beadle coughed preparatory to bidding her good night, bashfully inquired whether he wouldn't take a cup of tea. Mr. Bumble instantly turned back his collar again, laid his hat and stick upon a chair, and drew another chair up to the table. As he slowly seated himself, he looked at the lady. She fixed her eyes upon the little teapot. Mr. Bumble coughed again and slightly smiled. Mrs. Corney rose to get another cup and saucer from the closet. As she sat down, her eyes once again encountered those of the gallant beadle. She colored and applied herself to the task of making his tea. Again Mr. Bumble coughed, louder this time than he had coughed yet. Sweet, Mr. Bumble? Inquired the matron, taking up the sugar basin. Very sweet indeed, ma'am, replied Mr. Bumble. He fixed his eyes on Mrs. Corney as he said this, and if ever a beadle looked tender, Mr. Bumble was that beadle at that moment. The tea was made and handed in silence. Mr. Bumble, having spread a handkerchief over his knees to prevent the crumbs from sullying the splendor of his shorts, began to eat and drink, varying these amusements occasionally by fetching a deep sigh, which, however, had no injurious effect upon his appetite, but on the contrary rather seemed to facilitate his operations in the tea and toast department. You have a cat, ma'am, I see, said Mr. Bumble, glancing at one who in the center of her family was basking before the fire. And kittens, too, I declare. I am so fond of them, Mr. Bumble, you can't think, replied the matron. They're so happy, so frolicsome, and so cheerful, that they are quite companions for me. Very nice animals, ma'am, replied Mr. Bumble approvingly. So very domestic. Oh, yes, rejoined the matron with enthusiasm. So fond of their home, too, that it's quite a pleasure, I'm sure. Mrs. Corney, ma'am, said Mr. Bumble, slowly and marking the time with his teaspoon. I mean to say this, ma'am, that any cat or kitten that could live with you, ma'am, and not be fond of its home must be an ass, ma'am. Oh, Mr. Bumble, remonstrated Mrs. Corney. It's of no use disguising facts, ma'am, said Mr. Bumble, slowly flourishing the teaspoon with a kind of amorous dignity which made him doubly impressive. I would drown it myself with pleasure. Then you're a cruel man, said the matron vivaciously, as she held out her hand for the beadle's cup, and a very hard-hearted man besides. Hard-hearted, ma'am, said Mr. Bumble. Hard. Mr. Bumble resigned his cup without another word, squeezed Mrs. Corney's little finger as she took it, and inflicting 2 open-handed slaps upon his laced waistcoat, gave a mighty sigh and hitched his chair a very little morsel farther from the fire. It was a round table, and as Mrs. Corney and Mr. Bumble had been sitting opposite each other with no great space between them and fronting the fire, it will be seen that Mr. Bumble, in receding from the fire and still keeping at the table, increased the distance between himself and Mrs. Corney, which proceeding some prudent readers will doubtless be disposed to admire and to consider an act of great heroism on Mr. Bumble's part, he being in some sort tempted by time, place, and opportunity to give utterance to certain soft nothings, which, however well they may become the lips of the light and thoughtless, do seem immeasurably beneath the dignity of the judges of the land, members of Parliament, ministers of state, lord mayors, and other great public functionaries, but more particularly beneath the stateliness and gravity of a beadle, who, as is well known, should be the sternest and most inflexible among them all. Whatever were Mr. Bumble's intentions, however, and no doubt they were of the best, it unfortunately happened, as has been twice before remarked, that the table was a round one. Consequently, Mr. Bumble, moving his chair by little and little, soon began to diminish the distance between himself and the matron, and continuing to travel round the outer edge of the circle, brought his chair in time close to that in which the matron was seated. Indeed, the 2 chairs touched, and when they did so, Mr. Bumble stopped. Now, if the matron had moved her chair to the right, she would have been scorched by the fire, and if to the left, she must have fallen into Mr. Bumble's arms. So, being a discreet matron, and no doubt foreseeing these consequences at a glance, she remained where she was and handed Mr. Bumble another cup of tea. Hard-hearted, Mrs. Corney, said Mr. Bumble, stirring his tea and looking up into the matron's face. Are you hard-hearted, Mrs. Corney? Dear me, exclaimed the matron, what a very curious question from a single man. What can you want to know for, Mr. Bumble? The beadle drank his tea to the last drop, finished a piece of toast, whisked the crumbs off his knees, wiped his lips, and deliberately kissed the matron. Mr. Bumble, cried that discreet lady in a whisper, for the fright was so great that she had quite lost her voice. Mr. Bumble, I shall scream. Mr. Bumble made no reply, but in a slow and dignified manner put his arm around the matron's waist. As the lady had stated her intention of screaming, of course she would have screamed at this additional boldness, but that the exertion was rendered unnecessary by a hasty knocking at the door, which was no sooner heard than Mr. Bumble darted, with much agility, to the wine bottles, and began dusting them with great violence, while the matron sharply demanded who was there. It is worthy of remark, as a curious physical instance of the efficacy of a sudden surprise in counteracting the effects of extreme fear, that her voice had quite recovered all its official asperity. If you please, mistress, said a withered old female pauper, hideously ugly, putting her head in at the door, old Sally is a-going fast. Well, what's that to me? Angrily demanded the matron. I can't keep her alive, can I? No, mistress, replied the old woman, nobody can. She's far beyond the reach of help. I've seen a many people die, little babes and great strong men, and I know when death's a-coming well enough. But she's troubled in her mind, and when the fits are not on her, and that's not often, for she is dying very hard, she says she has got something to tell which you must hear. She'll never die quiet till you come, mistress. At this intelligence, the worthy Mrs. Corney muttered a variety of invectives against old women who couldn't even die without purposely annoying their betters, and muffling herself in a thick shawl which she hastily caught up, briefly requested Mr. Bumble to stay till she came back lest anything particular should occur, and bidding the messenger walk fast and not be all night hobbling up the stairs, followed her from the room with a very ill grace, scolding all the way. Mr. Bumble's conduct on being left to himself was rather inexplicable. He opened the closet, counted the teaspoons, weighed the sugar tongs, closely inspected a silver milk pot to ascertain that it was of the genuine metal, and having satisfied his curiosity on these points, put on his cocked hat cornerwise and danced with much gravity 4 distinct times round the table. Having gone through this very extraordinary performance, he took off the cocked hat again, and spreading himself before the fire with his back towards it, seemed to be mentally engaged in taking an exact inventory of the furniture. Chapter 24 treats of a very poor subject, but is a short one, and may be found of some importance in this history. It was no unfit messenger of death that had disturbed the quiet of the matron's room. Her body was bent by age, her limbs trembled with palsy, and her face, distorted into a mumbling leer, resembled more the grotesque shaping of some wild pencil than the work of nature's hand. Alas, how few of nature's faces are left to gladden us with their beauty! The cares and sorrows and hungerings of the world change them as they change hearts, and it is only when those passions sleep and have lost their hold forever that the troubled clouds pass off and leave heaven's surface clear. It is a common thing for the countenances of the dead, even in that fixed and rigid state, to subside into the long forgotten expression of sleeping infancy and settle into the very look of early life. So calm, so peaceful do they grow again, that those who knew them in their happy childhood kneel by the coffin's side in awe and see the angel even upon earth. The old crone tottered along the passages and up the stairs, muttering some indistinct answers to the chidings of her companion, and being at length compelled to pause for breath, she gave the light into her hand and remained behind to follow as she might, while the more nimble superior made her way to the room where the sick woman lay. It was a bare garret room with a dim light burning at the farther end. There was another old woman watching by the bed, and the parish apothecary's apprentice was standing by the fire making a toothpick out of a quill. "Cold night, Mrs. Corney," said this young gentleman as the matron entered. "Very cold indeed, sir," replied the mistress in her most civil tones, and dropping a curtsy as she spoke. "You should get better coals out of your contractors," said the apothecary's deputy, breaking a lump on the top of the fire with the rusty poker. "These are not at all the sort of thing for a cold night." "They're the board's choosing, sir," returned the matron. "The least they could do would be to keep us pretty warm, for our places are hard enough." The conversation was here interrupted by a moan from the sick woman. "Oh," said the young man, turning his face toward the bed, as if he had previously quite forgotten the patient, "it's all U.P. there, Mrs. Corney." "It is it, sir?" asked the matron. "If she lasts a couple of hours, I shall be surprised," said the apothecary's apprentice, intent upon the toothpick's point. "It's a break-up of the system altogether. Is she dozing, old lady?" The attendant stooped over the bed to ascertain, and nodded in the affirmative. "Then perhaps she'll go off in that way if you don't make a row," said the young woman. "Put the light on the floor. She won't see it there." The attendant did as she was told, shaking her head meanwhile to intimate that the woman would not die so easily. Having done so, she resumed her seat by the side of the other nurse, who had by this time returned. The mistress, with an expression of impatience, wrapped herself in her shawl and sat at the foot of the bed. The apothecary's apprentice, having completed the manufacture of the toothpick, planted himself in front of the fire, and made good use of it for 10 minutes or so, when, apparently growing rather dull, he wished Mrs. Corney joy of her job and took himself off on tiptoe. When they had sat in silence for some time, the two old women rose from the bed and, crouching over the fire, held out their withered hands to catch the heat. The flame threw a ghastly light on their shriveled faces and made their ugliness appear perfectly terrible, as in this position they began to converse in a low voice. "Did she say any more, Annie dear, while I was gone?" inquired the messenger. "Not a word," replied the other. "She plucked and tore at her arms for a little time, but I held her hands and she soon dropped off. She hasn't much strength in her, so I easily kept her quiet. I ain't so weak for an old woman, although I am on parish allowance. No, no." "Did she drink the hot wine the doctor said she was to have?" demanded the first. "I tried to get it down," rejoined the other, "but her teeth were tightly set, and she clenched the mug so hard that it was as much as I could do to get it back again. So I drank it, and it did me good." Looking cautiously round to ascertain that they were not overheard, the two hags cowered nearer to the fire and chuckled heartily. "I mind the time," said the first speaker, "when she would have done the same and made rare fun of it afterwards." "Aye, that she would," rejoined the other. "She had a merry heart. A many, many beautiful corpses she laid out, as nice and neat as waxwork. My old eyes have seen them, aye, and these old hands touched them too, for I have helped her scores of times." Stretching forth her trembling fingers as she spoke, the old creature shook them exultingly before her face, and fumbling in her pocket, brought out an old time-discolored tin snuff-box, from which she shook a few grains into the outstretched palm of her companion, and a few more into her own. While they were thus employed, the matron, who had been impatiently watching until the dying woman should awaken from her stupor, joined them by the fire and sharply asked how long she was to wait. "Not long, mistress," replied the second woman, looking up into her face. "We have none of us long to wait for death. Patience, patience. He'll be here soon enough for us all." "Hold your tongue, you doting idiot," said the matron sternly. "You, Martha, tell me, has she been in this way before?" "Often," answered the first woman. "But will never be again," added the second one. "That is, she'll never wake again but once, and mind, mistress, that won't be for long." "Long or short," said the matron snappishly, "she won't find me here when she does wake. And take care, both of you, how you worry me again for nothing. It's no part of my duty to see all the old women in the house die, and I won't, that's more. Mind that, you impudent old harridans. If you make a fool of me again, I'll soon cure you, I warrant you." She was bouncing away when a cry from the two women, who had turned toward the bed, caused her to look round. The patient had raised herself upright and was stretching her arms toward them. "Who's that?" she cried in a hollow voice. Hush, hush, said one of the women, stooping over her. Lie down, lie down. I'll never lie down again alive, said the woman, struggling. I will tell her. Come here, nearer, let me whisper in your ear. She clutched the matron by the arm and, forcing her into a chair by the bedside, was about to speak when, looking round, she caught sight of the two old women bending forward in the attitude of eager listeners. Turn them away, said the woman drowsily. Make haste, make haste. Sorry about my dog. The two old crones, chiming in together, began pouring out many piteous lamentations that the poor dear was too far gone to know her best friends, and were uttering sundry protestations that they would never leave her, when the superior pushed them from the room, closed the door, and returned to the bedside. On being excluded, the old ladies changed their tones and cried through the keyhole that old Sally was drunk, which indeed was not unlikely, since, in addition to a moderate dose of opium prescribed by the apothecary, she was laboring under the effects of a final taste of gin and water, which had been privately administered in the openness of their hearts by the worthy old ladies themselves. Now listen to me, said the dying woman aloud, as if making a great effort to revive one latent spark of energy. In this very room, in this very bed, I once nursed a pretty young creature that was brought into the house with her feet cut and bruised with walking, and all soiled with dust and blood. She gave birth to a boy and died. Let me think, what was the year again? Never mind the year, said the impatient auditor. What about her? I, murmured the sick woman, relapsing into her former drowsy state. What about her? What about... I know, she cried, jumping fiercely up, her face flushed and her eyes starting from her head. I robbed her, so I did. She wasn't cold. I tell you, she wasn't cold when I stole it. Stole what, for God's sake? Cried the matron with a gesture as if she could call for help. It, replied the woman, laying her hand over the other's mouth. The only thing she had. She wanted clothes to keep her warm and food to eat, but she had kept it safe and had it in her bosom. It was gold, I tell you, rich gold that might have saved her life. Gold, echoed the matron, bending eagerly over the woman as she fell back. Go on, yes, what of it? Who was the mother? When was it? She charged me to keep it safe, replied the woman with a groan, and trusted me as the only woman about her. I stole it in my heart when she first showed it me hanging round her neck, and the child's death, perhaps, is on me besides. They would have treated him better if they had known it all. Known what? Asked the other. Speak. The boy grew so like his mother, said the woman, rambling on and not heeding the question, that I could never forget it when I saw his face. Poor girl, poor girl. She was so young, too, such a gentle lamb. Wait, there's more to tell. I have not told you all, have I? No, no, replied the matron, inclining her head to catch the words as they came more faintly from the dying woman. Be quick, or it may be too late. The mother, said the woman, making a more violent effort than before. The mother, when the pains of death first came upon her, whispered in my ear that if her baby was born alive and thrived, the day might come when it would not feel so much disgrace to hear its poor young mother named. And, oh, kind heaven, she said, folding her thin hands together, whether it be boy or girl, raise up some friends for it in this troubled world, and then take pity upon a lonely, desolate child abandoned to its mercy. The boy's name? Demanded the woman. They called him Oliver, replied the woman feebly. The gold I stole was... Yes, yes, what? She was bending eagerly over the woman to hear her reply, but drew back instinctively as she once again rose slowly and stiffly into a sitting posture, then, clutching the coverlet with both hands, muttered some indistinct sound in her throat and fell lifeless on the bed. Stone dead, said one of the old women, hurrying in as soon as the door was opened. And nothing to tell after all, rejoined the matron, walking carelessly away. The two crones, to all appearance too busily occupied in the preparations for their dreadful duties to make any reply, were left alone, hovering about the body. We'll stop there and start tomorrow with chapter 25. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.